People who have spent time in a psych ward, what's the craziest thing you've witnessed? My mother worked in an asylum in Ireland when she was about 15. This was in the early 60s. She loved working there, despite the fact that some of the patients would physically try and kill her. One patient always stuck out to her. Every day, he would tell my mom he was going to kill her when she finished work. She knew he loved music, so would tell him she was out dancing that night, and could he wait until the next day, which she agreed to. The next day, he would forget what he had said, and would threaten her again, and she'd say the same thing again. This went on for a couple of years that she worked there. Story 2. I was in an adolescent inpatient facility for 30 days. Two people come to mind. One kid named David, who was very tall for his age. I think he was only 13. He insisted on watching Friday the 13th movies on movie nights, and everyone was afraid to disagree with him because of his violent nature and frequent homicidal fantasies. He hated taking his meds, and probably 2 or 3 times a week, he'd brawl with the psych nurses over it. No joke, it took 5 to 6 large grown men to overcome this kid. He was scary. The other one was just sad, a girl named Wendy. She was 13, really nice, but she always wore the same clothes and she stank really, really bad. Apparently, this is a common defense for kids who have been repeatedly SA'd/assaulted by family. They don't clean themselves, or they'll even soil themselves to make themselves undesirable to their abuser. I gave her a big hug every night in the common area when it was time to go to our cells. Story 3. My brother-in-law had a stint in a psych ward a little over a year ago, and on a particularly manic day, they were in the middle of the community room and started singing, "I have a structured settlement and I need cash now." This was then met by about 40 to 50 psych patients shouting back, "Call J.G. Wentworth, 877 cash now." After getting a few verses in, the orderly stepped in and kindly requested they stop, which was kind of a shame since it sounded like they were all having a good time. Story 4. I've worked in one for about 2 years now. The staff are just as crazy. Here's some highlights. Patient got into the ceiling. Couldn't get them down for a while. Patient milked themselves into their coffee. Did you know some antipsychotics make you lactate? The entire adolescent unit escaping because maintenance forgot to lock the gate. Don't worry, they all came back eventually. And myself getting a concussion from a patient trying to escape. They weren't successful, but at least I didn't work for 6 weeks. Story 5. I was a social worker at an institution that had a hall for what we called lifers. It was essentially for people who had no hopes of ever being released due to their conditions. Anyway, my hall had 14 beds and it was full. There was this one guy who was huge. He was 6'7" and about 350. His name was Simon. He suffered from drug-induced schizophrenia and had bipolar disorder. He talked to himself all day, but never talked to others. All the other men in the ward were scared of him. It was my day to do first shift. I got there early to start on some paperwork I needed to finish. When I got my keys in the door, I heard Simon hit the door with his fists. I looked through the tiny window on the door, and he in the hall was covered in blood. I panicked and called security for backup because I thought he had killed somebody. Turns out, Simon was in the throes of an extreme manic episode and had managed to walk the literal soles of his feet off. Other medication he was on thinned his blood and led to him bleeding all over the place. We checked the camera footage and he had walked and talked all night. The orderly, who was fired that day, had slept through his whole shift and never heard Simon walking back and forth. Story 6. A girl grabbed my toe while I was sleeping. I woke up and said, "What the F?" and she ran off. I went to the front desk to complain, and while I'm talking to the lady, the girl jumped on my back and clung like a monkey while screaming. It was bizarre. I threw her off me, and the lady just said, "Sorry about that, LOL." So low-key, that just sounds incredibly disturbing to be sound asleep and then to be awoken by somebody yanking on your toe. I don't know why, that sounds awfully uncomfortable. Story 7. Not super crazy, just odd. Was with a bunch of teens on a pediatric ward, but we all had special rooms by the nurse's desk with shatterproof, wired glass, so the nurses could always look in on us easily, and the bathrooms had no locks. Myself and another girl were in for anorexia. Another guy was wanting to self-unalive himself to the point where he couldn't have any cutlery but a plastic spoon for meals, no blankets, special pajamas, etc. And then there is a young homeless guy who'd been hit by a car while squeegeeing for change, so his leg was in a full cast. Yet he still had a habit of sneaking around in his wheelchair and hoarding extra supplies from the kitchen, the kids' playroom, the nurse's station, etc. So they kept him in one of the psych rooms. We formed a weird little club and would often play cards in a lounge area together. Conversations would go something like this. Me: "Hey, does anyone want this cheese? I snuck it into my pocket, so nurse thought I ate it." Homeless kid: "Mine! Dibs! Here, you can have these breads I swiped from Craft Time." Other anorexic: "I'll get you some ice cream and saltines if you find me some sewing gear. I'm gonna sew some batteries into my hair scrunchie for my next weigh-in day." Kid: "Do you think I'd die if I could scoop my eyeball out with a spoon?" And so on. It was a very bizarro time in my life. Story 8. The funniest thing I ever saw. Spent total of about 3 years in my teens and early 20s. A kid in seclusion who was having a genuinely good time making staff's life a living nightmare while he was in there. Took apart the plastic mattress, tore the foam inside into small pieces, donned the empty mattress and started yelling, "I'm Gumby, damn it," while tossing the pieces of foam around like confetti. Even most of the staff are laughing about it. Story 9. I worked in Involuntary Psych for 5 years as a technician. You see a lot. Some genuinely funny and lighthearted, some very gross, and a lot tragic. Had an older gentleman that looked and dressed like a member of the Rat Pack. He was a lifer, pretty calm when he was on his meds. His thing was he had no control over his speech center and would just stream of consciousness all day to whoever was near. He would say something like, "I used to work down at the mill and my landlady Grace, she loved coffee." Or, "I would be in trouble with my uncle." That was him asking you for a cup of coffee to drink. I miss him. Very sweet man when he wasn't yelling at you. Sometimes patients would come in that had been around a few times and knew the system. They won't force you to take meds in jail, so these guys would act out violently to get to jail where they wouldn't be forced to take meds. I responded to a call for staff. I was in the nurse's station doing paperwork, and I burst out of the door and headed towards the day room at a flat run. Dude heard me coming and waited in ambush at a 90-degree corner right at the end of the hall. He had picked up one of the light plastic chairs we had and swung it at me like a bat. I managed to get my arms up to block, but he stepped into the swing and used the chair like a lever. Threw me 15 feet back down the hallway. I weigh about 150 pounds. I managed to get away with a small bruise on my arm and butt. The patient got what he wanted and was sent to jail. One of the places I worked had these conjoined courtyards that were shared by 2 units at a time. A tech from each unit was assigned to monitor the yard, and we would usually sit on a bench where we could see everything and just chat during yard time. So this patient from the other ward came over to sit with us. Smelled gross. He had paranoid delusions, real tinfoil hat stuff, and I said to him, "Hey, do you know the one place where the government can't watch you? The shower." To my amazement, it worked. Happily went to his unit to take a shower. Cue 10 minutes later, this guy comes running out of his ward and into the courtyard, butt naked and soapy, being chased by 2 other techs. I felt a little responsible for this, so I joined in the chase. He ran around the courtyard a few times before we chased him back into his unit and to his room. He jumped up on the bed and looked at us. Since it wasn't my patient, I let the other 2 techs take the lead. The guy fainted left, then lunged right to try and jump on his roommate's bed. The 2 techs lunged after him and managed to get a hold of his sweaty arms. Did I mention he was so slick and sweaty that he had already literally slipped out of our hands a few times? And the whole group of them tripped their way onto this second bed together. The patient got turned face down and landed on the bed. One of the unfortunate techs slipped on the tile floor and landed nose into the patient's butt cheeks. I'll never forget that. Story 10. When I was 19 and admitted the first time, I was anxious already and could barely sleep the first night. My roommate was quiet, which didn't alarm me at first. The next day, I went into the common room and talked to some people, and then later went back to my room and found that my roommate had scribbled "find them" all over the walls and was talking to herself. I was terrified and grabbed a nurse who tried to talk to her but couldn't make any sense out of what she said, and I asked to stay in another room. I stayed in the restraint room that night by myself and woke up the next morning to a fight in the hallway and nurses running past my room. Apparently, one guy pulled out his male chicken part in front of the wrong patient and got punched. Then, later that week, I was cornered by the same guy who pulled out his male chicken part and asked if I wanted to have sex in the bathroom. I literally cried after that and was effing terrified, so I would say my whole first trip there. Story 11. Not a patient, but an employee. Seen countless patients attacked by other patients, many serious injuries, and a couple that came close to death. Some of the patients' backstories can be wild. Some are almost unbelievably tragic. Some are legit criminal. Some of the most foul and disgusting personal hygiene I've ever witnessed. Worst was a patient who had no concept of using a restroom. They would simply crap or piss themselves wherever they were sitting or standing. It was real fun when they decided to do it during mealtime. I think the most shocking thing, though, is how you can have some truly awful and psychotic patients who turn out to be genuinely cool people once you get them on consistent meds. I'm talking 100% turnarounds. Of course, then they get discharged, stop taking their meds, and the cycle repeats. Story 12. Not a patient, but an employee. Had a 16-year-old kid come in who was about 6'2", 220 pounds. Built like a linebacker. I found out, since he was technically a child, he somehow ended up at an autism school for children with very little security. He ended up inflicting a TBI on one of the teachers and got sent to us. The kid had a violent streak, the likes I hadn't seen before. He knew he was stronger than most and liked to fight unprovoked, and it always took 4 to 6 people to restrain him. I'd never seen a patient spend more time than him in the safety room, an incredibly small, padded room with nothing in it. His parents wouldn't authorize his move somewhere else, and they wouldn't take him home either. We were not equipped for someone with his level of violence, so there he sat for 1.5 years. It wasn't like a single incident that was crazy, it was the entire situation. Story 13. Not a psych ward, but an inmate at a jail I spent some time as a trustee at who was very mentally ill. Dude had apparently been arrested after being drunk for the better part of the last month straight, and was withdrawing hard, as well as obviously not being all there mentally. He was in his own isolation cell, and everyone had heard him screaming all sorts of perverse, insane, and nonsensical crap since he was put in there. A while after dark, we got called over to do a cleanup of his cell, and what I saw in there was like something out of a horror movie. Blood on every surface, as well as just about every other bodily fluid one can imagine, as well as crap. Even on the effing ceiling, and that must have been a feat to accomplish. Parts of his scalp had been pulled off and stuck to the mirror over the sink, which contained a mixture of the aforementioned bodily fluids and was no longer draining as a result. To top it off, he had pulled out many of his own teeth, which were scattered just about everywhere. I didn't vomit, but I certainly would have if I had stayed around. I just noped out and told them to get someone else to handle that. Easily one of the most disturbing things I've ever witnessed in person, and really showed me a different side of mental illness I'm not sure I'm glad to know exists. Yeah, personal dismemberment, that's got to be incredibly disturbing to witness. And of course, the crazy part is these people with the mental illnesses, they probably don't even feel that level of pain. They don't realize that they're destroying themselves. Just really tragic. Story 14. A woman I shared a room with demanded to be discharged. It was a voluntary admission, so her doctor discharged her on condition that someone else pick her up and take responsibility for her. Her ex-husband came and signed the discharge paperwork. Then they handed him all her medications. He proceeded to give her the meds to pack it in her bag and left the room while she was packing. No one else was in the room with her at the time, and she proceeded to drink most of the pills she had. A nurse found her drinking the pills and got the other nurses to help restrain her while they waited for the paramedics. The paramedics loaded her up and took her to the government hospital. I hope she's okay and doing better now. There is a guy who was completely narcissistic and managed to piss off all the other patients by insisting that people who have attempted self-unaliving themselves are weak and should just get on with it. He was also delusional, insisting that he was the CEO of a big company and better than everyone else. After that, everyone shunned him. Many years ago, I was a student nurse and had one patient that had frequent psychotic episodes with times of lucidity in between. During one of his psychotic episodes, he managed to rip out his IV line, his catheter, and then threw his glass water carafe on the floor. Everything was sopping wet, and there were glass shards all over the floor. I did manage to get him to sit in a chair while I cleaned up the floor and remade his bed with dry bedding. Then I tried to dress him in dry PJs. It was at that moment that a whole platoon of medical students came into the room with their professor to see another patient. This guy then decided that I was the sexiest thing alive and tried to kiss me wherever he could while I was trying to dress him. Instead of helping, the medical students just laughed their asses off. Eventually, we had to restrain this guy because he was still in the midst of his psychotic episode. The next day, I had to help the same guy wash up, but this time he was lucid. I'll never forget him apologizing for the previous day. I'll never forget what he said next. "I'm not nuts. I'm a fruitcake, really." And the first thing I thought was, "Dude, you're a nutty fruitcake." Didn't say it out loud, though. Story 15. Another story is not as crazy as it is heartbreaking, but in my time, I've seen my fair share of self-unaliving ideations patients, but only once have I seen someone who had completely, in every possible sense of the phrase, given up, unlike anyone else I've come across. He was 60 plus and spent his whole life homeless and in and out of institutions, living with his brother and his brother's family periodically until the patient became too much of a burden for the family. I spent every shift with him on a one-to-one, ordered to have eyes on a patient 24/7, as every chance he could get, he would self-harm with whatever he could find. I'm only a technician, so I don't have a degree of any sort other than a high school diploma. I still would listen to him talk for the hours I spent with him. The most nihilistic and pessimistic tangents I've ever heard. A sense of hopelessness and despair I've never considered possible. Even the mountain of medications he was given seemed to have little effect. And then, as his hold ended, he was discharged. I'm not a doctor or certified in any way, as I stated before, but I can't believe he was given the okay to be released. This event sticks with me because I was left without any answers or explanation of what happened. The next day, his room was occupied by a new patient. Story 16. Most amazing. For some reason, a piano was in the psych ward. A patient who never spoke started playing. She knew every piece by heart. The entire ward of psychotics, manics, and even staff went and sat in that room. Not a word was spoken for a good half hour. Craziest? Family members choking a patient because his sister gave another patient a BJ. A guy who thought he was Jesus convincing the entire ward to meet on the balcony to discuss ways of breaking out. A guy would run away every day, steal a car, and drive back to the ward. People speaking in tongues. It's scary. Okay, so just random observation, but how was this guy able to break out and steal a car? Once, let alone daily, unless this is all just in his head. I don't know. That was kind of weird. Story 17. I work in EMS and volunteered in a psych ward briefly, so my experience is always a bit superficial, but the craziest part for me is how a lot of patients oftentimes act completely normal and rational. I've transported a lot of people to a psych ward that they were diagnosed with all sorts of illnesses, but from my interaction with them, they were completely normal and just had some general anxiety. A lot of people I've observed and wondered, why the hell are they even here? Story 18. Guy had a tattoo carved into his neck. Apparently, he took a pin in his fist and repeatedly carved it into his skin right on his neck. It looked very scratchy and was still red, despite it apparently being pretty old. You know how really young kids grip a crayon in their fist and grind it against the paper really hard? If you've made a fist with your left hand and put it below the left ear, that was exactly how he must have done it. Story 19. The saddest thing ever. They had brought this lady with dementia in for a while. Her husband had just died and she was not doing well. We would be sitting in a group and she would look up and say, "I need to call Bob. He doesn't know where I am." Then they would ask her where Bob was, but she didn't know. And then they would tell her that he had died. She would break down and they would take her back to her room to rest. And this happened like 10 times a day. I had to watch this lady learn that her husband had died over and over again. It was brutal. Story 20. It felt like I was in a movie almost. There was a girl my age and a man about 10 years older than me, Richard and Jess. Jess greeted me with a conversation like, "Yeah, they said I'd be here only a few days too. It's been 3 months now. Be nice to the nurses and maybe they'll let you out early." Alright, sounds like the start to a horror game. Richard was more friendly and loved going on about quantum physics, saying it'll change our future. We were at a table and out of boredom, I folded some origami. Richard picked it up and started telling me about how I should market my origami figures. Besides that, room temp coffee, no butter knives, and staff outside the shower door. Oh, and the unnecessary amount of sedatives for a wanting to self-unalive teenage girl. Story 21. I'm dedicating this comment to Gregory Phillips of Woodstock, Virginia. I've been to preteen, adolescent, 5 months, and the adult regular wards, as well as a different adolescent ward for violent offenders, 6 months, and a different adult ward for paranoid delusions, very briefly. The craziest thing I saw wasn't even the patients, although I have some wild stories in that area. It was the staff. It blew my mind how little they valued human life on the inside. It's like they weren't there to help. They were sadists too. I'm only going to share a handful though. On the preteen unit, age 8 to 12, there was this kid, Philip, maybe 10 years old. He refused to shower, so a group of 3 grown men hand-washed this child. On the regular adolescent unit, I saw surely more than 10 people get shot up with booty juice and ratchet strapped to their beds with the lights left on for up to a full day. I myself, at 15, Was kept in a padded room with a camera and no lights for a few days because I was shadowboxing my mattress. I was only allowed out to shower, and then they had a guy watch me shower with no curtain. At a later point, they prescribed me to this medicine, Prozac. I told them it wasn't working and just made me way more depressed, so they tripled my dosage. I didn't want to take it, but they would restrain me if I didn't, which meant booty juice, so I took it anyway. Ended up slicing my arm with a straight hair comb from the bottom of my forearm up to my shoulder. They erased that medication from my life. On the violent adolescent ward, it held people from 14 to 21, with new intakes coming from West Virginia, Tennessee, all the way down to Georgia. My unit was on the top floor and held the people deemed the most violent and/or flight risks. It was a lot more chill though, honestly. A lot of flights, but no real punishment and relatively lax security. More like a jail than a mental institution, except for the security. Not all people had mental issues per se, mostly just gang members and people who acted the part but didn't really play it. Like broke his mom's arm and now that he's on the inside wants to act like a thug to try and avoid getting bickered kind of thing. I'll have PTSD for a very long time from the first adolescent place, but I still saw some effy crap from the staff on the second. Like this guy, Charles. I don't remember what happened, but that goes to show that it wasn't anything serious at all. No booty juice at this place, so he got pretty physically restrained. Picture this, 6'3", 240-pound, 34-ish-year-old black man squeezing the soul out of a 5'7", 130-pound, 15-year-old white boy. His face was blood red because of all the vessels in his face popped, and he kept screaming, "Knox, please let me go! Please, please, Knox, I'm chill! I'm chill!" Then, boom! He body slammed his ass full force into the concrete anyway, after which Charles vomited all over the floor. Another staff situation that will forever piss me off is the story of Gregory Phillips. He wasn't my friend or anything, but he was a pretty cool guy, relatable even. Except he had been in jail and later psych ward since he was 12. He was at this point 17. He was about to get out when he was 18. One of the staff members told him, quote, "You've been in so long, boy. You'll be back." Well, he never went back. He got into some allegations with the law shortly after that, which were probably true. He posted bail and unalived himself in his closet. A decision I completely understand. After 6 years of that, I'd rather die too. It's weird because I've had quite a few people die in my life. Greg, I didn't really even know that well, but he sticks with me. I still see his face sometimes walking around a Target or in line at the movies. He could have had a life. He made his own choices, but they didn't help him. He needed help, and they wasted 6 years treating him like an unwanted animal and a criminal that couldn't be helped. What else was expected when he got free? As far as I'm concerned, his death is on their hands. The adult wards were pretty damn chill, but they were in an area that had lots of money. So that's the difference with my thinking. Man, if Greg could have gotten the treatment that I got in the adult ward up in the wealthy college town, he might have turned out all right. I want to add, I'm not the only one that thinks it's inhumane. Of course the other patients did, but you may say, how valuable is a psych patient's ward or some BS? So I ran into one of the staff members I was cool with on the regular adolescent unit earlier this year when my wife had the flu. He's training to be a radiologist now, but he said that he quit that job after only working there for 4 months because he didn't want to be a part of hurting children. His exact words. Story 22. Not much in particular. I just kinda had a bit of imposter syndrome because I saw people zoinked out of their minds from schizophrenia or bipolar meds or whatnot. And there I was, just kinda like, I'm sad and wanna die sometimes. The craziest thing was how hard they tried to shove religion down our throats. Seemed almost criminal, to be honest. Story 23. I visited the psych ward as a psychology student, part of a mandatory course, and spent a couple of days there practicing interviewing patients. My personal worst memories are the old man who was catatonic and who could have died without anyone noticing for I don't know how long. He looked dead all the time, and the lady who kept picking the worms she hallucinated off her skin. I can't imagine what it must be like living like that, but it's heartbreaking to watch. I knew some of them had been violent. I knew the ward was locked for a good reason, but these two haunted me the most. Mental health matters. Please take it seriously. Story 24. Had a rough time my first year at college. Almost unalived myself and got put in psych for a week. The ward was a chaotic mix of Alzheimer's patients, detoxing addicts, and us mental health folk. There is a separate unit for the older folks, but it was overcrowded my first night there. So I, a dissociative mess coming coming off of sedatives, had a mumbling old woman for a roommate. She kept calling me her daughter's name, was flopping around in her bed, coming up to me and getting in my face, begging for me to help her escape. I told the nurses, but they didn't care. I was able to go in and out of sleep briefly and woke up to a horrid smell. Somehow, she managed to squat over a cup and take a crap in it. When I saw her and realized what was happening, I bolted from the room and finally an attendant took me seriously. She was relocated to the Alzheimer's ward, and luckily my new roommate was a regular old depressed wanting to self-unalive person just like me for the rest of my stay. I could go on and on about the neglect and abuse from the staff, but that was by far the most extreme experience I had. Story 25. I saw a 90-pound, 5-foot girl toss one of those 18-liter water cooler bottles, a full one at that, at a bunch of nurses trying to calm her down as she was having a manic episode. It took a few security guards and quite a few nurses to take her down. I'd just been talking to her the previous evening, and she was an absolute sweetheart who gave me a book as a going-away gift, as I was being discharged the next day. I still own that book, and I still think about her and wonder from time to time what she's up to do. We're briefly in contact, but she dropped off the face of the earth. A close second would be the time from my second stay in another psych unit in 2021, where a guy was going through alcohol withdrawals and screaming about a bear coming into his room, and they had to lock him into his room and keep him heavily sedated. When he was allowed to mingle with people, he was still relatively sedated, so confused and lost, and kept asking me and other people if we knew what happened to the bear. Pretty sure he was an absolute hardcore alcoholic that had fried his brain, and I felt pretty bad for him. Story 26. It was me. When I fell asleep due to the large amount of meds, via shot, they were giving me, I was knocked out cold constantly. I remember waking up due to the male nurse having to hold me down while they administered a thing that would knock me out. I have no recollection of the place I was in, nothing. I don't even remember how long I was in there for. I went willingly due to sleep episodes. That's why I was held down. Story 28. Man, when I was like 16 to 17, I was forced into one for reasons. There were 16 of us, including me. Thank God, because we had to have roommates, and the nurses tell you nothing about the person moving in your room. This is bad because they lock all the doors every night at a certain time, like jail. But I was number 16. Odd numbers are amazing, so I had no roommate till someone else came along. There was one kid who would act totally normal most of the time, then just freak out for no real reason. Then the very large men nurses would hold him down, as the doctor would inject him with what we called booty juice because it goes in your ass cheek as they hold you down. You pass out in like 10 seconds, then they drag you to your room where you wake up 3 to 5 hours later, and everybody acts like nothing happened. He wasn't the only one to get it. We all were scared. They would all be like that, but don't do that or you'll get booty juice. But this kid got it almost every day. So the real story there was one night where I guess he snapped in the middle of the night. There was a large kid for his age. He looked like a middle linebacker from the NFL, and this was a younger than 18 only place. So he decided to beat the crap out of his roommate one night in the pitch black, and all I could hear was this kid screaming for his life. Then he broke down his door. This is a large wood door with metal interior, like a front door of your house. But he ripped through it like the Hulk after he was done with his roommate. Then was trying other doors, I guess, to find another person, and he was beating on doors and screaming like a maniac. Maybe that's why he was there, but damn, that was the longest, well, felt like hours, but it only lasted 20 to 30 minutes. Hoping my door was solid enough, or he wouldn't try my door till the nurses gave him the booty juice. The next morning, everything was normal, and we played basketball, watched TV, and everyone acted normal. He was chatting my ear off about who knows what. I was in my head thinking, okay, yeah, whatever you say, just don't kill me. I was only there a week, and damn, that's not the only story. That crap is life-changing, and not in a good way. Story 29. Oh man, I wish I could have commented earlier on this because I have some doozies. This is sure to be buried. However, I was in a long-term facility in my early 20s. There was a man named Vince who would wait by the door all day for the senator to pick him up. One day, he busted in my room screaming that I stole his Guatemalan coin collection. Bless him. Willie, another man in that same facility, would follow me around and whisper that he was going to kill me and my mother. Bessie was another patient there, and she would have violent outbursts in the middle of the night. She fought off 2 staff members and was subsequently transferred to a more appropriate facility facility for her, not jail. In a different facility I was in, a woman named Catherine would go into people's rooms while they were in group therapy and try on their underwear. I've been in multiple facilities and met tons of interesting people, but these were the standouts. Story 30. This is maybe a little different than what you're expecting, but the most shocking thing to me was how the system in the US is so scarily easy to fall into and get stuck in. My mom is bipolar and also has a narcissistic personality disorder, so growing up, she was extremely controlling of me, saw me as an extension of herself, basically. She didn't like it when I went away to college and had cut all ties with her. I was naive and finally told her that since I was self-funding my education and was an adult, there was nothing she could do to control me anymore. Boy, was I wrong. Hours after I asserted my independence, police knocked on my door. They politely informed me that my very concerned mother had requested a wellness check, reported that I was at risk of harming myself, and that they were required to arrest me. I was cuffed and put into a cop car right then and there, and they took me into the local emergency room for evaluation. This emergency room had a separate psychiatric section, and I was locked into a padded room with literally nothing. No phone, no bed, just an empty, white, padded room. I was left alone there for 13 full hours with no food, and no one came to check on me. I had to use the bathroom and eventually couldn't hold it anymore. I was about to leave for work right when the cops came, and wasn't able to call in, so I was worried about what was happening with my job. I was extremely stressed out by the time the doctor came to assess me. She didn't ask what was going on, only said that they were going to admit me and asked if I go voluntarily or involuntarily. Explained that voluntary meant 3 days. I started to try and explain what happened. She said that she'd hold me involuntarily then, and just left. A nurse did eventually bring me food, water, and a gown, but it was another several hours stuck in that room alone. Eventually, they transferred me to an inpatient center. They loaded me up in a transport ambulance strapped to the bed, and off we went on a 5-hour drive to that facility. The ambulance guys were the first ones that actually listened to me after the whole mess started. They released my hands and even let me smoke cigarettes in the back with them. The nurses during intake at the inpatient place were so kind. They listened to my story of what happened, seemed to believe me, and allowed me to make just one phone call with their cell phone. Otherwise, I wasn't allowed to call anyone. I called my aunt to tell her what happened and begged her for help. Seconds later, I encountered my first other patient who jumped on me, knocked me to the ground, and shoved his hand down my pants. The nurses and staff were incredibly nice. They gave me a lot of advice. They actually suggested I pretend to be anorexic, which wasn't hard since I was extremely skinny and their food was awful, so I could have some disorder to treat and show progress on. Unfortunately for me, the head doctor was on vacation, so I wasn't seen or evaluated. I spent 2 weeks there. My family, minus my mom, called and visited every day, driving 4 to 5 hours each way. They explained what happened, what my mom was like, but since the attending doctor was on vacation, I wasn't allowed to be released. Eventually, my family hired lawyers and threatened to sue the place, and I was finally let go. It was the most terrifying and frustrating experience I've ever had. It still haunts me to this day. It made me realize my freedom is just an illusion, and at any moment I can be locked up and held against my will with no rights or way out. I also didn't have health insurance at the time, so the bill was insane. It took me 15 years to pay off and just finished a couple of years ago. Story 31. Not a psych ward stay, but I have PTSD from a tragic incident, and on the first anniversary of that, I ended up in the psych pod of the emergency department because I was having an hours-long anxiety attack. They took all my clothes and made me wear a hospital gown and hospital socks and put me in a padded room with a hospital bed for hours. At one point, I asked to go to the bathroom, and I was escorted there and had to leave the door cracked with an attendant outside. The bathroom had feces strewn all over it, and when I told the attendant, he just shrugged that he didn't give a crap. There were all sorts of other patients there, and most seemed homeless. This was in a city. Anyway, my husband was finally let in to be with me, and he started getting agitated because no one was coming to talk to me or discharge me, and I had been just sitting there for about 12 hours. Finally, a couple of doctors came in, gave me a prescription for Xanax, and some lists of therapists to call. The male doctor's name was Dr. Pepper. No joke. I was discharged that night, and the next morning, I started calling some of the places on the list. The first couple of times I called and said, "Hello, my name is blah blah blah. I was referred to your office by Dr. Pepper at a psych unit at blah 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 hospital." And they hung up on me. LOL. I assume they thought I was prank calling. Anyway, I learned my lesson and ride my anxiety attacks out at home now. Well, first of all, not making light at all of the PTSD, but I do like how this post OP portrayed it in a lighthearted way, like asking Dr. Pepper or telling Dr. Pepper that there's crap strewn all over the bathroom, and then he said, "I don't give a crap," wink wink, nod nod, like that's just, I don't know. Sometimes you just have to laugh at your own misery. Anyway, let's move on. Story 32. Was admitted December 3 years ago. Before that, I had a sibling who was in and out of the care system for years prior. She had ward mates. One of them was convinced he was the Terminator. Talked like him, dressed like him, carried around a banana for a shotgun. Another lady was dancing around the room, sticking to the walls, then taking her clothes off. She tried touching several of the males on ward before it was discovered that her husband had just died a few days prior. There was an old fella with super bad anxiety, but he was really nice, and at the hospital I was at, they had an ECT, electroconvulsive therapy ward. After his first session, he was unquestionably changed by the experience. No longer nice, but not horrible. He said he, quote, just felt empty. Strangest thing that happened to me was probably making a person up. I was friends with a person called Chris, who apparently didn't exist. I'm not psychotic, which made it all the more odd. I think it was a coping mechanism. Mostly, though, what stuck with me, I met so many creative people, painters, poets, musicians, sculptors, and dancers. People who I may never come across again, but we shared a few weeks of life together. Story 33. Nothing crazy really happened, just the kinds of things you would expect to happen when you house 20 people with various mental health issues together in a supervised environment. One girl wouldn't talk for the first 2 days she was admitted, and refused to sit in the chairs in the dining room. She just laid on the floor. I saw a total hardcore biker gang looking dude who was at least 6 feet and 225 pounds, weeping tears uncontrollably. Me and about 5 other patients that were close by just went and sat with him and put our hands on his shoulder, but we didn't say anything. There was one guy who thought there were cryptic messages specifically for him being transmitted through the TV and written in the newspapers. I kept clear of him. Another man would routinely ask me if it was AM or PM. He had no perception of the time or the date. It was sort of sad, and I never got annoyed with reminding him when he asked. There was one severely depressed old man who kept completely to himself, but he would actually talk to me in one specific scenario, when it was only the two of us out in the smoking pit sitting on the park bench. He was a very smart man, with an entire lifetime of wisdom to share, only in very small doses. He had never seen a vaporizer before in his life, until I used one sitting next to him, so that was the worldly wisdom I was able to give him. Each room had a TV built in it, but they were literally tube TVs from the early 2000s. Big black boxes with a bubble screen, which I thought was hilarious, lol. Story 34. I was not admitted. However, my high school job was working in the cafeteria at one of the local hospitals. One of the duties I did for that job was taking carts full of dinner trays to each floor/wing of the hospital. The mental health wing was always a bit intimidating to deliver trays to, since I was still basically just a kid, especially since that wing was always locked and you were supposed to always deliver there with a partner. You were required to take the tray cart into the middle of the wing to the nurse's station, past their reaction room and a hallway full of rooms. It was about 100 feet one way. One night, we were short-staffed, so I didn't have a buddy to make a delivery with me. I had been in the position for a while and had never had any incidents happen before, so I wasn't extremely worried about having to deliver there by myself. I unlocked the door to the wing, made the walk to the nurse's station, and quickly spun around to make my walk out. I was about halfway down when I heard someone yell, "Stop!" I quickly turned around. Initially, I saw one of the nurses standing and pointing towards me, looking extremely stressed. It was at that time I noticed a female patient sprinting towards me. She was a petite, maybe just 5 feet tall and 100 pounds soaking wet, but had an extreme look of determination. Now, I'm not a small guy, but I froze in fear. My training about having to call a doctor strong when a patient attacks the staff started playing in my head. She kept running right up to me, stopped inches from me. I thought she was going to try and take the key from me and escape. She reached and embraced me with one of the nicest hugs I've ever received to this day. I was still frozen in fear, hands at my side, clutching onto that key for dear life. She then looked right into my eyes and said, "God loves you and he wants you to know Jesus." At that time, a couple of the nurses had just made it to me too, to try and halo. She then gently let go of me and walked back towards the recreation room. I just kind of stood there for a second, making eye contact with the nurses. I'm sure I was pale as a ghost. My heart was racing. The nurses asked if I was okay, which I was, but I couldn't muster any words, so I just nodded. They went back to check on the patient, so I went back down to the kitchen, still a little in shock. Later, security came down. I'm assuming the nurses had to report that included. I had to relay what happened to them, and then never heard anything else about it. Story 35. I opened up to a therapist just once. I was a kid. I got into a fight. The doctor asked me question after question, got me so scrambled up. Next thing I know, I was shanghaied upstate to a nitwit school. You know what a nitwit school is? Not just for nuts in the head, but bodies too. Back then, science was real crude. They stuck us all together. My roommate was a frog kid. You ever see a frog kid? Story 36. My great aunt used to work in one. It was a while ago, so things have improved. She described one woman who would just walk around carrying a doll everywhere and clearly not in the right state of mind. When my great aunt asked why the woman was in there, it turned out that she had a child before marriage, so her baby got taken off her and she got sent to the mental institution. Another one had been in there since he was a boy. He had stolen an apple and kept it until he was in his 80s when he got kicked out due to budget cuts. Story 37. I was there twice, for the same reason, wanting to self-unalive ideation, almost back-to-back for a total of 60 days-ish. I could write a book about either time. 30 days in a mental hospital is enough for one interesting book. The violence, the stories, craziest. You see, do you mean the people or what happened? How about this? A lady asked me to give her the newspaper I was reading, and I said no. Somehow, this turned into her asking me for sex. I said no to that, too. She was persistent until I said, maybe ask me later, and she got this beatific look on her face and left. Later, she's walking around the hall naked looking for me. I hide until a nurse takes her back to her room. We hear her screaming from her room. We all think it's naked lady, mad she's being made to get dressed. But I wandered over because I felt slightly responsible. I didn't get there in time to intervene, but I saw some of it. Naked lady had beaten the nurse to the ground and was biting a giant chunk, think golf ball size, of flesh from her neck. So that was fun. Arguably not the most violent thing I saw, by the way. That was probably when this guy named Danny hit this girl Becky because she didn't like him sexually harassing her, something staff doesn't do anything about. Several women used me for protection because I'm 6'3" and can stare another guy down if I have to. Anyway, a lot of guys in the mental hospital were actually from prison. Some were going back to prison when they were done there. Others, this was kind of our state's prisoner mental health routine. Do nothing while they're in prison, send them to the psych ward for 30 days to fix them when their sentence is done, or that was my impression. So this dude named Jason had his cell block number tattooed on his face in 3-inch tall numbers. Very quiet, like you could tell. His prison term had taught him, don't make noise, don't get involved. But he had mommy issues or something. Denny hit Becky. Becky kicked Denny in the face and put him on the ground. Good Becky. I liked Becky, if you discounted how crazy she was. Jason became effing Batman. I'm not effing kidding you. 1 minute he was sitting on the floor across the room. I forgot he was there. Then he was somehow 12 feet up in the air. He landed on Denny, who had just got up, and put him on the floor again. But he landed in a way so he was sitting on Denny's chest. He then started punching Denny. It was effing brutal. It was a goddamn metronome, somehow almost impersonal. Bam, bam, bam. I could tell Jason had done this before. He was an expert at it. He was hitting hard, fast punches, but in a rhythm. I crap you not, I think he was pacing himself. Fast, hard punches, but don't overexert yourself. You're going to be punching this guy for a while. You don't want to tire yourself out. Denny wasn't all the way out, and he was flailing his arms around and screaming. I didn't even think he was doing anything, but when they finally showed up to stop the violence, they break up fights quickly, but at their convenience. It might be 1 minute or 10. Denny had a pen in his hand, something you're not allowed. Ever seen someone stabbed about 50 times with a pen? How much damage could it even do? Well, when they finally showed up to stop the fight, Jason was a effing robot. He never stopped or slowed down punching Denny, but when the cavalry got there, he stopped, stood up, calmly and quietly. He never made any noise, and he walked to his room. right past me. His face was a effing sheet of blood, with like purple splotches where Denny had stabbed into his face, blood all over his shirt. If someone dressed like that for a Halloween movie, you would say they overdid it. Jason didn't seem to even mind. So, sorry for the length. I could go on, and on, not endlessly, but for a while. Like, I didn't even mention the big fight while I was there, and I was involved. A nurse I liked got choked out, and I helped save her and took down another, different inmate. P.S. Denny lay there screaming until the EMT got there. He was in the hospital a few days. Jason was transferred to a different ward. A deep scream. I can't explain it, but it was an ugly, brutal, painful sound. It isn't a sound you hear often, and I don't need to hear it again. Story 38. As soon as I walked in my third time, a girl threw a chair at me. She was small. I think she was around 12, and it was a light plastic, but damn. On my first visit, they had to take me outside through the gate into the backyard, through the playground entrance into the building because a girl was beating everyone up and screaming and throwing herself at the door because she got switched to our side because she was caught effing another patient. She got booty juice. On my birthday, one girl was jealous, so every time I got attention that day, she would fake a seizure, and when that didn't work, she would keep saying she seen dead people and, like, was in a fetal position, jerking her head around saying they were coming for me. Staff ignored her because she was not schizophrenic. She was in there because of behavior like that. All mild cases, but it was the children/teens ward. Went there 4 times. Last visit ended with me in foster care custody because they finally believed my parents were the problem. Story 39. A guy tried to kill me when I was visiting my brother-in-law. For some reason, the visits were held in the common room. This guy came up to me first day and told me my wife was now his girlfriend and sat like 2 inches from my face the entire visit, staring aggressively. No matter how many times I asked the staff, they said he was doing nothing wrong. Next visit, he picked me up from behind and tried to throw me through the effing window into the staff room. The staff helpfully locked themselves in there while I fought a 6'5" schizophrenic man for several minutes. Eventually, it took like 10 nurses to restrain him. Other patients started freaking out and trashing crap, kids visiting, screaming in terror. Absolutely horrible place to be, in my town at least. Story 40. I got sent to a psych ward because my psychotic narcissistic mom made up a bunch of lies about me trying to unalive myself as a teenager so that she could play victim and get sympathy from other people, so that she could stop me from telling other people she refused to sign paperwork, letting me receive a full scholarship and stipend to live overseas as an exchange student, and to prevent others from believing me when I mentioned revealing all the horrible details of how she treated me as a kid. Craziest thing I saw then was there was a girl that was brought in screaming the same night as me while strapped to a bed. She was heavily bandaged on her forearms and was threatening to kill everyone around her. Looked like something straight out of a horror film, to be honest, except she didn't have any supernatural powers. A week later, I see her for a second time in a group therapy session. Looked totally normal besides the bandages and the orderlies behind her, and not talking much at all and not sharing why she was there. Was pretty surprised that she was very pleasant and nice, besides what I had seen the first night and in group therapy sessions, so I didn't think much of it. Eventually, I was told by doctors that I was totally fine besides being a victim of my mom's narcissism. They walked me through everything that I was experiencing and offered to help me get emancipated, but that it was my decision in the end and encouraged me to open up about my situation to the group sessions. So I did, and I couldn't believe the reaction that the girl had to my stories. She basically was dealing with the same thing, except it involved a lot more physical and SA. And before I knew it, she took over the session detailing how she came to be in the psych ward. Apparently, she was being SA'd by her father, which she said in a nonchalant way like it was normal. But then she started telling her that she was going to kill her mom and force her to marry him and have a daughter for him to play with before knocking her out cold. When she woke up, she found him passed out drunk in his chair, so she tied him up with everything in the house she could find to strap him down so he couldn't move and then forced him to wake up. She discussed how she then proceeded to slowly carve off his private parts and burn them to stop the bleeding as much as possible before cutting his lips off and blinding him. After she told us in detail that she beat him to death, starting with his fingers and toes, and then worked her way up until he wasn't breathing anymore. By that time, the cops came, and she was adamant about taking her own life too, so she wouldn't serve any time for what she did to him. So she quickly hurt herself from wrist to elbow on one arm, then tried her best to hurt the other when the cops pulled the knife away from her. The look in her eyes while she told the story was terrifying and empty, and everyone sat silently for a long time before the therapist dismissed everyone but her and called in the other doctors that were watching via monitors behind one-way glass. 20 minutes later, a bunch of cops show up and stay there for hours. I left 3 days later, and she just got out as I was leaving. She ran up to me and hugged me, then whispered in my ear that she wasn't getting charged and would soon be there for a while, as she would most likely be ordered by the court to stay an extended period of time. She then thanked me for helping her open up by me talking about my experiences. Then she gave my mom the same look she had when telling the story in session, but filled with a mix of contemptible, murderous anger, and said loudly, "Be safe and take care of yourself." Story 41. I was put in one because of a bunch of bullcrap earlier this year. I remember this guy I really related to told a patient advocate that he was witnessing a guy fondling a female patient in front of him. Now, even though I didn't witness the whole thing, if it wasn't enough that I already related to the dude that was informing, the reaction of the other guy would have been enough. The guy who reacted to the informing reacted by headbutting this dude's glasses and yelling about how he's a snitch mother effer, and you could actually see veins sticking out of his head of the guy who was yelling. That's when I closed the distance a bit. My fists were in balls, and if he swung on or hit the bespectacled guy in any way, I was going to fight on behalf of the guy who had glasses. Bespectacled guy could either fake not being in fear really well, or he was actually telling the truth. The other guy was saying how he would beat his ass, to which he calmly said, "You could try," saying a bit later that he was trained in martial arts. I really hope I would have gone through with fighting alongside bespectacled guy against the other dude, but I don't know if I would have. The one who yelled snitch was taken away to another unit. Story 42. Not really something I witnessed in the ward, but I went in for wanting a self-unalive ideation. My first time seeing a therapist, and I was unaware they would send you if you even thought about those things. Anyway, it was the beginning of March 2020. For the first week, my BF at the time and my mom would visit or call daily. One day, everyone just stopped getting visitors or calls. They wouldn't let us watch TV or listen to the radio. This went on for several days, and everyone was kind of freaking out and coming up with theories from war to zombie apocalypse. Turns out, COVID lockdown had begun, and cutting us off from that info was their way of trying to keep us from freaking out. They didn't even tell us. After several days, they allowed each person to have a phone call. I learned the situation from my mom, who thankfully is in the medical field and could explain it in a rational way, and wasn't allowed to speak to my roommate until she had her call. Coming out to the world in lockdown was such a surreal experience. I knew my life would likely be different after being in there, but didn't expect it to be this. Story 43. Work security for an emergency behavioral health. I saw many, many crazy things, many sad things, and many confusing things. The one I shall share today is the woman who started throwing rocks at the window of the staff area. Why do you let the patients have the rocks, you ask? We don't. She smuggled them inside herself. A substantial number of rocks, approximately golf ball sized. So just thinking about the anatomy of this, how many golf ball sized rocks could you smuggle in internally? Like clearly more than I'm thinking. That's gross. Story 44. I had a shorter stint in a mental hospital, and the craziest thing I saw was enacted by a staff member. We were having a group session when one of the counselors came in, waving a book and screaming at one of the residents. He was yelling about doing a spot check in the boys' room and how he found this satanic book. On the way out of his room, he claimed to see 2 hounds from hell in the bathroom, frightening him and causing him to run into the meeting in quite a state. He ranted on for a little bit, accusing this kid of being a Satanist, eventually throwing the book in the middle of the circle. It was a collection of Isaac Asimov's short stories. Story 45. I spent about 9 days in the psych ward in Atlanta. Made a friend who was convinced he had AIDS, and all the doctors were lying to him because he was black. He was terrified that he passed it to his girlfriend and the baby she was pregnant with. There was also a Muslim woman who never spoke, but I lent her my shampoo, so we developed some trust between us. She eventually told me her husband had her committed because she didn't want to be with him anymore. He was abusive to her and their children. There are so many more stories. I really wish I could check in on these people. However, this was way back in 2007. Story 46. Not my story. My wife works as a nurse and spent some time in mental health units. A 60-year-old lady came in because she stopped taking her meds while traveling with her husband. She came out of her room, stood in front of the nurse's station, and started announcing to every person around her that she was the devil and also Jesus, and that they needed to bow down and worship her. She proceeded to remove her hospital gown, wrapped it around her head in some kind of shawl, and started bowing and chanting on the floor butt naked. Multiple visitors, including her husband, were watching the whole thing. Nurses, including my wife and her husband, were trying to redirect her back to her room or put a blanket around her, and she was just fighting everyone off. Her husband was so embarrassed, he just stopped trying to redirect her and left. Another one is a guy who was recently admitted, was coming down off something, and was constantly pestering the nurses to go out for a cigarette. You can't smoke in a secure unit. He got sick of the nurses saying no, flew into a rage, and in the process bit off his own finger. When the nurses came to help, he was yelling at them, "Look what you made me do! You C-words should have let me out for a smoke!" My wife had to pick his finger up off the floor.